Hello. In this exercise, we're going to be looking at creating and maintaining data tables in SQL. The maintenance and creation of data tables is part of SQL's data definition language. Let's go ahead and use the Chinook database and drop the table we're planning on creating just in case it exists from a prior exercise. Our next SQL statement is the create table statement. But before we execute this statement, let's take a look at how it's constructed. My first line says create table and my table name. After that, in the parentheses, are my list of columns that I want to create within the table. My first column is my album ID. I have it defined as an int, an integer, and not null, meaning that it will not accept any null values. Just a point as we create our tables that the first column in our table, by convention and typically within SQL, should be the primary key for that table. My second column, album ID, it's also an int and it's not null. This is a foreign key into my album table. So when I go to do a lookup or a join, I'm going to join on album ID. My rating, int, allows nulls. My notes is a varchar 255, and this is typically a text field that we're going to put into our table to allow us to write some comments in there. The next two lines are what we're going to call constraints. And a constraint allows us to check on data input to make sure that information being entered is correct and valid. For instance, my primary key constraint here is on my album. That tells me that this needs to be unique and also cannot be null. Constraint foreign key on album ID tells me that this is a foreign key into the album table and that the field that it should look for in the album table is album ID. Let's highlight this SQL statement and go ahead and execute it. We can verify that the table's been created by refreshing the schema in the management section and expanding the list of tables. We now see my albums in my table list. Also, expand the columns to see the list of columns. My next two SQL statements, alter table, allow us to modify and maintain the structure of our tables. Let's go ahead and highlight the first SQL statement, which drops or removes the column my underscore rating. The second SQL statement now adds a new column called my rating without the underscore. Again, we can verify the outcome of our SQL statements by looking at the schema section in the management area. Let's add a row of data into our table by using the insert statement. The syntax is insert into my table with a list of the fields that I want to use for the insert command, values, and then the list of values. A select statement shows that the data has been added to the table. A second insert statement adds another row to our table. This time, however, our field list is short one field, my rating. When we insert the record into the table, the my rating field is left null. The select statement selects the fields from the table that we want to look at, but here we've added if null, my rating will return null. We initially inserted the row with a null value for the my rating column. Let's now look to update that to put in a value of 4. An update statement is created with the following syntax. Update, table name, set column name equal to the value I want to update, where my album ID equals 2. The where statement limits my update to only the rows that I want to update. We run the select statement again, and we see that the value of the my rating column is now 4. When we created our table, we had two constraints listed. The first constraint was a primary key constraint, and the second was a foreign key constraint. Our last three SQL statements are to demonstrate the impact of having those constraints. The first insert statement attempts to add a record to our table that lacks a primary key. When we execute this command, an error message is returned in MySQL that tells us that the primary key needs to be specified. The second insert command attempts to add a row to the table where the foreign key that's specified doesn't exist in our reference table. Again, when we execute, an error message is returned telling us that the foreign key needs to exist. Finally, the last statement has correct syntax with both the primary and the foreign keys that are correct. So when we highlight the insert statement, the third one, execute it, we will successfully create a row in our table. Simple select of our My Albums table shows that we now have created a new row. This is the end of this exercise.